All right, let's get this party started. Hey everyone, how you doing? Welcome back to EDG 5666, Knowing and Learning in Secondary Schools. I'm Joe Watts, your fearless leader once again, and this week our focus question will be, to what extent do culture and language influence how students learn? Thanks for joining me. Let's get this party started. So I'd like to start with this quote by Naila Nasir, who is an educational anthropologist. And she and her colleagues say something that really sums up the core idea that we'll explore this week. And that is that learning and teaching are fundamentally cultural processes. And I'd like you guys to really keep in mind that not only is learning a cultural process, which we're going to explore more in depth in just a moment, but so is teaching itself when you really think about it. For example, let's say you've had the luck and the good fortune to be able to travel outside of the United States, perhaps see other cultural experiences, maybe even visited schools in other countries or attended schools in other countries. Pretty quickly, you'd be able to see that the customs and the ways that people interact with each other and the content, how it's presented, is really distinct depending on the cultures that you're interacting with or that the regions where you may have been. So teaching is absolutely a fundamentally cultural process as well as learning. And some of the ways in which learning is cultural is through the tools that we use and how we learn to use them and how we're taught to engage with those tools specifically. You're going to see a pretty fun example of that in just a minute. But first, I want to draw your attention to this iceberg. It's very important for us to really define culture. You're reading from this week, we'll do that for you, but I wanted to show you this model, which is the iceberg concept of culture that you're going to be working with in several ways. So keep this model in mind. This model, it doesn't really describe anything about culture other than the fact that 9/10 of it is below the surface. But what it describes are facets of culture. And one of the first things you see here is that culture is not race, it's not ethnicity, but there may be similarities of cultural norms around an ethnic group or racial groups. Okay, to reiterate, it is not necessarily by race or by an ethnicity. It's more that these customs, values, and practices that we share, when we belong to a specific cultural group. Okay, so you may belong to several cultural groups, right? The first cultural group may have been started with your family, your family composition, who it consists of, where you were raised, how you were raised. But even as a teacher and a student, there are cultures. So this model right here, the iceberg concept of culture is trying to really break down the different levels at which we tend to see or not see one another's, one another, and how our own cultures. So if you see the first cultural level, on the left-hand side, that is the surface culture, this is usually the first type of connection that's made in education, but it has its limitations, right? And it can be stereotypical. Just like when you would have a potluck or something like that, you might bring a dish from your cultural background or ethnic background. It's a way to begin the process, sure, right? Including students' home and community lives, but it can also be, quite centralizing. And it's also superficial, it's the surface level, not bad or good necessarily, but it is superficial. However, when you start to move like an iceberg above that surface down to all of the anchoring pieces that hold this iceberg afloat, or to help this individual become a cultural being, you start to see the shallow and deeper levels of culture. And these are actually the levels that are often unspoken, but usually make the biggest difference. And whether we feel connected to someone or different than someone, this is where you start to see how people distinguish themselves as a group or out of the group. So these examples may include just reading off of the slide itself. This may be nonverbal communication patterns. It could be very verbal conversation patterns. To give you a personal example, my family is Colombian. It's very, very common in my Hispanic family to interject and jump over one another when we're talking. When I was growing up, this was a sign of attention and engagements. Whereas in other cultures and geographic regions, it may be disrespectful to do that. I've had that experience personally a few times. So just from my own personal experience, that's one example of how, as you move down under the surface of the water into these deeper levels of culture, these are the different aspects of who we are that often isn't expressed in the classroom or connected to instruction, but can be, some of them may not be appropriate for the classroom, but all of them, that are on here are ways that we can identify ourselves and others as cultural beings. And so this week, one of the ways that you're going to be interacting with this is to interview your group members based on, these areas. And not all of you get to pick the areas, but you will be learning more about your group members and their cultural identities, and hopefully something about yourself as well in the process. All right, this is the this is the example I was telling you about, use of tools in the previous slide. Now, another way that learning is culturally influenced, again, is by tools. Not only which, to clarify, not only which tools we use, but how we use them. And by a tool, I don't necessarily mean like a hammer or a wrench or something. It's an object that allows you to carry out a function. It's a tool for carrying out and executing that function. So in doing that, I'd like you to take this look at Lucy here. This is not my child. I don't have kids. But through this video, I'm going to show you her use of tools at a pre-verbal stage, very, very culturally situated. Yeah. Oops. All right, so you get the idea, right? We see Lucy here using a phone. In this example, again, she's pre-verbal, so she may not be speaking a specific language that's identifiable, but she's using a tool that she has very likely seen others, using, and she's using it in a way that's consistent with what she's seen. This is an example of how culture influences learning. And another thing to point out is that education begins at home. That's the other reason that this video is important for us this week. I think it's a pretty common sense statement, but it's very easily forgettable that, we see it through a negative lens, like things we have to correct, but your child, your student that came into the classroom, they've been learning for ages before they even got to you. So the more that we think about how to recognize cultural influences on their learning, their tool use, the ways that education shapes them and has been shaped in their home life and continues through schooling, the better we recognize that, the better we can, we can be at meeting the needs of our students. So the idea of culture influencing learning comes from this notion of cultural difference theory. It's not the only theory that talks about how cultural influences learning. There are a lot more ways that we could even discuss in the whole course, okay? But the picture that I show you here, I like for you to think about this idea of bridging between the students' home and their community lives in the schooling cultures. So the idea behind cultural difference theory is that the closer a student's cultural practices are to that which are already valued in school, the easier the transition from home life is. So let's say that the left-hand side of the graphic and the school life is on the right-hand side of the graphic. So, it's almost a seamless transition. However, if someone is coming to you, a student is coming to you from a very different cultural experiences with a very different set of values and experiences than which that we value or practice in school. The idea is that they have to do a lot more work to cross that bridge over to school culture. So cultural difference theory acknowledges this idea not only that we are cultural beings, but that children growing up in different cultures learn in different ways, and that the closer those ways are to school, already the easier it will be for them to succeed, because those practices, are very similar to those norms. And so if you're aware of how individuals and a culture might have been taught to learn, you might be better able to teach and to work with them successfully. So with the spirit of that in mind, this week you're going to be thinking about how you might find out more about how your students learn at home and in their community through practitioner articles, through reading, through interviewing each other. So let's talk about some more specifics here. So your weekly On Track for Success slide here shows that you'll be completing this week's reading journal prompts. And the Finding Reading Journal will be due on the 13th. You will meet with and interview your group members, and please do explore the course resources and the task description of what you'll be doing in your time together before you meet. So, and continue your progress on your clinical interview part 1 as well. So that's it for this week. I'm really excited to see what you learned about each other and how you think about the ways that who we are as cultural beings influence not only how we learn and the prior knowledge that we bring to the classroom, but also how we as educators teach and what our teaching patterns and approaches and beliefs are like. So have a great week, guys, and take care. Please reach out for any questions.